So first of all, thanks so much for the invitation to speak. I'm really glad to be here. And I think the project so far has been wonderful. I've learned a lot. I'm a philosopher by training, so much of this kind of, skirts my understanding. And most of the research that I do is in qualitative research. As we just heard, my activities range mainly in humanitarian health ethics. So when the closures were announced and the pandemic was evolving, I kind of thought, oh, well, nobody's going to be traveling. There's probably not much for me to do. I'll just take a break, sit back a little bit and relax and see what happens, see how things evolve. And very quickly got involved in, probably I think Ross's fault, that I got involved with WHO's Solidarity Platform trial and the questions revolving around what's been called good participatory practices. I'm not alone in these activities, and as you can see, some of our collaborators have been named. I'm Lisa, but I wanted to particularly mention Dr. Pushpita Hossain, who you'll see as we go along. I'll be sharing a little bit of preliminary analysis of a qualitative study, and Dr. Hossain has been instrumental really in keeping it going and leading it. Also collaborators at Oxford University, Dr. Alan Davies, and then Sonia Delat at McMaster, and wanted to acknowledge Dr. Nina Gobat at WHO. So I see, and then I do this, right? Okay, I can coordinate that. Community engagement is a term that we hear. We haven't heard a lot about it in the last couple of days, so it's interesting. And we were just now chatting at the table, and Sarah said, oh, but we're not hearing about community engagement much. Some a little bit about patient engagement, but really not at the level that what we tend to hear in other clinical settings or clinical research settings. But I do think that it's growing, and I think that community engagement, patient inclusion have evolved quite a bit. Here in Canada, we talk about the SPORE initiative. I think it's PPI in the UK, but various different activities encouraging clinicians and researchers to involve communities as much as possible in their research. This is really important. I think it's evolved in various different ways. It's become important considerations in the practice of clinical research. And a number of years ago, really around the AIDS research era, the concept expanded a little bit more to be something called good participatory practices. I'm curious to know how many have heard the term GPP or good participatory practices before today. So very few people think about it or talk about it, but I think it's in the essence of the ways in which, and I think the motivations of how we don't just engage communities, but engage our partnerships. So as WHO documents state, good participatory practice for emerging pathogens research, which is what we were looking at around COVID, is a principle-based approach to effectively engage stakeholders in the design and conduct of prevention and treatment trials for emerging and re-emerging pathogens. And I don't know if that sets your hearts racing when we start talking about involving people in the design and conduct. But that's the thing about, yeah, I'm seeing some nods. I mean, that's the thing about community engagement, or that goes beyond community engagement with GPP, is thinking about not just informing people about your trial as you're about to initiate it in order to facilitate your recruitment, but thinking about that kind of engagement early on. And some of you may already be doing that. And that this has, in both instrumental and intrinsic value, which I'm going to spend a bit of time describing. So good participatory practices helps ensure respectful community engagement and strengthens trust through collaborative partnerships. It can include all sorts of things, or we'll talk a little bit about what some of those things may be, but it can include where we were making use of things like stakeholder mapping, so figuring out who your stakeholders are, but also going beyond just the who to mapping them into power relationships. Who are the people who might be affected, the kind of nothing about us without us orientations, and also who has strong interests but have very little power to influence decisions and designs and outcomes involved. We talked about engagements across communities. We involved community advisory boards, or at least attempted to do that, and updated communities and did various different kinds of update activities that were required all the way through. And again, I'll talk about more of this as we go along. The aspirational potential benefits, the ones that we intend and that we hope will be the case, but one of the things that's sorely lacking at this stage is any, hard evidence about the effects, I guess, the benefits, and maybe even some of the challenges associated with things like good participatory practices and community engagement. Do we know that it works? How much does it work? Instinctively, I want to say yes. Sometimes I feel like maybe we don't need to gather any more evidence about this, but the truth is that we don't know. And I think when we're trying to make the persuasive argument to crowds like this, it probably would be useful to have more of that kind of hard data. So that's part of what we initiated, what we tried to do. At any rate, what those benefits include are enhanced relevance of the intervention. So when you go into research, thinking that research needs to be responsive to a priority that this particular community might have, as opposed to just guessing, finding out what are their priorities and engaging with them to determine that in advance. Understanding things like suitability and feasibility of the trial design. Did we, are we making the right kinds of choices? Should we be making other kinds of choices? Questions about recruitment that you talked about before, that Laimei just talked about. How do we know that this is going to work until we implement or until we ask and find out? And then also all the way through to improved uptake of findings, because if you talk to your community first, if you find out what their priorities are, what their issues are, if you involve them throughout the study, the likelihood is that at the end of the study, whatever outcome there is more likely to be taken up by the community because they are invested in it. They saw the relevance to them in the first instance. And I'd say that these are potential benefits, but to a certain extent, I think it's reasonable to expect that it might be possible that would be the case. I want to take a pause for a moment to distinguish between community engagement and what we're understanding as good participatory practices. And I will say too that I'm not sure that my aspirational view of GPP is something that we achieved either in the activities around the WHO study or I think anywhere. And maybe, and you can tell me if you think that's true, maybe my aspirations are just unrealistic. So I hope for the best, but I don't know for certain. At any rate, good community engagement involves seeking to engage the community to achieve long-term and sustainable outcomes, processes, discourse, decision-making and implementation of projects and programs. It's intended to create more effective solutions, empower and integrate diverse population, provides opportunities to discuss. So all of these things you can imagine getting a group of people in a community or a group of patients to come together, telling them about your study, and then hoping that they'll support it in some way. A lot of the time, community engagement does happen in this one way, in the way that we're doing right now. Somebody standing at the front of the room who tells everybody what the study is and why it's important, and then everything, maybe you get a short Q&A and we walk away. Good participatory practices is supposed to go beyond that. It's supposed to excel well past that. Here we're talking about involving various stakeholders. In things like design and conduct and of various kinds of trials, including prevention and treatment trials. And you can imagine with platform trials, it was one of the most insightful things I'd heard during my discussions about them. There was I was with a group of MPH students here at U of T, and we described platform trials as, something centrally designed. They had read a paper about it and what they look like. And her first response was, thereby killing any opportunity for somebody from the community to have an influence in the trial design. So I think it's probably one of the big challenges, and we'll talk about that some more. How do we engage those people who are going to be most affected by a trial, whether they be the participants who eventually enroll in the trial, or the collaborators who, at the local PIs at a distant site, have the opportunity to genuinely influence the way the trial is run, when it's also very important to have a cohesive design that is implemented in various different places, all in the same way with some consistency and harmonization. So where do we draw the line, and where do we make it possible for local investigators, for example, to actually influence the way the trial is going to be designed? We hope that it will be mutually beneficial, that it will sustain relationships. It's another thing I think that's really highly underestimated and undervalued, is that when we have these good partnerships and we work through those good partnerships, they are sustained. And the anticipation is that you'll come back and do more research with that group again. Because as soon as people start to feel like they're not included in the process, or not adequately included in the process, they lose interest and they'll go elsewhere. They'll maybe collaborate with others, or in some cases, they just refuse to collaborate with anybody again because it worked out so badly. So thinking about how we sustain those mutually beneficial relationships is a key aspect to what we saw good participatory practices could bring to things like platform trials. And it's good relationships with trial sponsors, with researchers, with all the stakeholders within the community. And so in my view of it, what I hope GPP could be is community engagement on steroids, right? It's community engagement together with good partnership practices. So what happened? Just to give you, that was a bit of a background on how I understand good participatory practices. What happened in March 2020? I got a phone call from somebody saying, quickly, could we have a quick discussion? They had developed a platform trial that was going to go global. First, it was a platform, to be honest, and then it was trials to associate with those trials, with those platforms. And Recovery and Remap CAP were others that were associating with it. So there were some existing platforms that were going to kind of be integrated in it. Initially, the intention was to do treatment trials, but soon afterwards, we were overwhelmed with, and all of our activities related to good participatory practices became affiliated with the Solidarity Trial vaccines. So we were looking at vaccine trials being implemented in countries around the world. Initially, 32 or 35 were interested. So we had a first meeting talking with 35 different country lead PIs. Finally, only 3 started at the initial launch, and we moved on to, I guess we'd say, 5 by today, which is close to the conclusion of the trial. The activity that we were asked to do was to provide some kind of bespoke program to support national leads in each of these countries to engage in what we called good participatory practices. And for the most part, that involved engaging the communities to understand what the trial was going to be about, what it would be like, what would be feasible. And we were, I guess, I don't know if it's fortunate or unfortunate enough, that there were some delays in the initiation, the launches of the trials in the various countries for various different reasons, obtaining the vaccines and contracts and agreements. But that gave some good lead up time, as much as 3 months, I think, for some of the countries to do some preliminary activities. And this ranged in various different ways, in part because some of the people who joined the trial, who were participating in the trial, came from countries where things like community engagement just weren't on the agenda. There was just no talk about it in some countries. Clinical trials happened, but participants were enrolled usually because they trusted their doctors to enroll, but the engagement practices just weren't there. in other countries, and I can tell you that in particular, countries in Africa came on to the engagement like a master class in community engagement. This is something that's been happening at a professional level for many years in countries like Kenya, particularly, was amazing, Mali as well, where they have professionals who are trained to engage with communities about clinical trials. There's an understanding, not just an understanding, but an expectation from clinical trialists that they will work with community engagement practices, that they'll get involved with things. And so they knew exactly what they needed. They had networks that they generously were willing to provide. And I think we can come back to that issue, so that things were set up and began to work. And what was neat was that this bespoke program, as we called it, apart from developing training and materials and all sorts of things that are on the websites, and that's available on links on the slides, which I think will be available to everyone. Yeah. So you'll have an opportunity to explore what some of those are, and there's a training module that's being prepared. All of those things were made available, but probably the thing that sticks with me the most was the weekly 7 a.m. Telephone calls, global telephone calls with participants from each of the countries, those leads, those people who were involved in leading good participatory practice activities in each of their countries associated with those trials. And those started in, I guess it would have been early 2021. And we had our last call last Tuesday, which I think is a sad thing, but it was pretty lovely at the same time. The trial, it was meant to be an adaptive platform trial, or is an adaptive platform trial, many different forms of vaccine, many different forms of vaccine delivery. Eventually, there were probably about 3 arms implemented in any given country, and also always with a placebo. I'll leave you to think about the placebo arm, because we'll come back to that as we discuss. And yeah, in this dynamic, extremely unpredictable pandemic context, this involved providing remote support, understanding that the work that they were doing would probably also have to be done remotely. We talked about the problems of how can we deliver good, good engagement practices in countries where not only did they not have adequate PPE available to people, but where people had to get out and work. Everybody was out and exposed, and at the same time not wanting to encourage that kind of exposure by people joining and coming to meet in groups in the settings. So through all of that, and over the last 3 years, all of this implementation, we realized that we were learning an awful lot. We were learning a lot from one another, from those global calls and from the activities, from the challenges that we met up with, and those difficulties. And so we decided to, I mean, we call it a qualitative study. We're doing it as a qualitative study. Really, it's an opportunity to come together to co-author with all the country leads, all the national leads, about lessons learned from the experience. But we've done it as a study, which I'll describe, to understand the ethical considerations and the practical implications of implementing good participatory practices for emerging pathogens research for an adaptive platform trial during COVID-19. Well, that's a lot of background. And a little bit more background, just to let you know, there's at least one paper has already been published. We did 2 rapid reviews about it. Lessons learned about everything that we need to know about GPP is that there's very little in the literature, and as I said, very little indicating the evidence for its for the benefits of doing it. We did a qualitative descriptive study effectively, which was embedded within the program implementation, so it was happening simultaneously. We did some in-depth interviews. It's a small number, 10 people, mainly because only 10 people were involved in those global calls most of the time. But each of those 10 people worked with others, and some of that we got to were added to in the discussions as we've gone along. Once we did those 10 interviews with the respondents, the national leads from some of the countries, we invited more people to a roundtable, eventually had 12 national GPP leaders. And we've recorded that roundtable discussion as well, and that will be part of the thematic analysis, which is underway. So you're getting previews of things to come. And I know you can't read this, it's teeny tiny, and it's actually a screenshot from some of the materials that are available online, so you can go to them specifically if you'd like to. I just want to describe again, or in a little bit more detail, some of the activities that were available. We created this sort of toolbox of resources for good participatory practices, some of which I think, like I said, in some communities it was redundant, they really knew what they were doing. Other communities it was new, but even with those who knew what they were doing, like I said, they still felt that they were learning from one another, and it was important for them to be able to ask certain kinds of questions. So we talk about just an overview of those of the tools in the toolbox are things that are related to things you need to do before a study starts. Ideally, if you have a bit of a leeway and a bit of a timeline, good to get started as soon as you possibly can when you get that funding, or maybe even before you get the funding, because you'd want to talk about it in your proposal, thinking about how are we going to engage not just community members, but authorities and leaders who can give permissions for research to take place, and then of course local co-investigators or local research implementers. During the study, there was a lot to be done as well. I mean, I guess, so I think I have some time just to give you a soupçon, a sort of a taste of what we did in the before the studies, or what was recommended. Was to I think we talked about identifying the study population and doing a power mapping with them, engaging with local national authorities. At one point we found ourselves on a Zoom call with all the mayors of particular regions of a given country, with them asking some really hard questions about why we would want to be implementing the vaccine trial in their settings. And because these were mainly low and middle income countries, and WHO is recognized as a leader, but also kind of, that feeling of people from high income settings going to low income settings, a lot of the questions that we were being asked were questions about, are we being treated as guinea pigs? Why here? Where is the study being implemented elsewhere? Is it being implemented in the global north? We had to come to a situation where we would be able to respond to some of those very difficult questions, and preparing talking points and data and information for the local PIs was one thing that was involved in that activity. We also did things like recommending the creation of a community advisory board, so that local information and ideas about local feasibility of the trial could be identified, but also things like the rumors. It's a global world now, and information circulates very rapidly on every smartphone, every radio talk show, and other sorts of things. So the concern of identifying those rumors, we knew that we couldn't respond to them, we couldn't stop them necessarily, but at least having a response to, here's other ways to think about it, was important for the good participatory practice leads. And then developing locally appropriate study information was another important thing. And I think I mentioned that we developed flip books, and we developed other means of communication The participants also, I mean, the leads, the national leads talk to us about ways in which that they usually use. I came across the term radio jingle, which was not the way I understood radio jingles, but radio jingles were effectively just announcements, things that come over the, the soft form technologies that are inexpensive, that everybody has access to. And another thing that was suggested was radio talk shows, call-in shows, or just a talk show where the local PI could be on the radio responding to questions either from telephone calls or from an educated radio DJ who could ask questions about the specifics of the trial. So all of these things were things that they began to do as we were thinking about launching the trial. Once the trial was launched, the intention was to monitor and implement the impact on the community. So, months into the trial, somebody said on a call, people are waiting too long in the lines. It's taking like 3 hours for them to see the recruiters and receive the information before they could enroll in the trial, let alone actually receive the vaccine or the placebo. This was important information to get back to us. So WHO eventually, worked pretty quickly with that community to figure out what the issue was, and they found different ways of channeling the activities so that actually they would do these sort of information sessions beforehand, and that led to a much more rapid process when the individuals eventually lined up for their individual consent process, which didn't stop them from asking questions. And of course, they were given much of the same information. It just happened more quickly, and they could still ask questions for themselves, but some of the discussion happened before. So during the study, very important to think about what's going on, what are the considerations, keeping track, sharing information also, because the other thing that happened was that story, when it was shared on our global calls, informed the other settings, and they looked into whether or not they were having a similar kind of problem and were able to adjust as well. After the study is probably the hardest one, and we're only at that stage right now, but I can tell you it's probably, and I'm sure, I mean, you're probably all thinking about it yourselves as well. One of the most difficult things we do is ending a study. And what we tend not to do very well is the restitution of findings. So we recommend that at the very beginning, before a study starts, a plan is made for sharing the findings with the local community. Very few communities do this. In research that we did that you can find on our website related to Ebola, it was the huge dismay of the communities who we were interviewed, survivors who had participated in clinical trials, and they told us, we don't know what happened. We gave our blood, we gave our time, we took the risks. Nobody told us the outcomes of the study. And when asked, what if the outcomes were inconclusive, they said, I don't care. I just want to know if it was inconclusive. I want to know how I contributed. I want to know what the outcomes of the study were. But we know the realities of it as researchers. We get some money, we exhaust our budget through the data collection stages, maybe into data analysis. And then by the time we're thinking about writing up our findings or disseminating our findings, we're already making an application for the next grant and maybe even starting that new data collection someplace else. The idea of returning is both costly and time consuming, something that we just don't have the capacity for because we didn't plan for it in advance. And so thinking about how am I going to, how do I end as I plan to or how do I begin as I plan to end, and understanding that we have a moral responsibility to doing that well. All of those things are things that we ask people to think about at the very beginning of the study, beginning of the trial, so that you don't find yourselves, thinking that, okay, it's enough. I've submitted to peer review. I got my paper published. It's not enough. It's not enough for the communities. And if you hope to maintain trust with them and go back again to do future trials, then it's crucial, it's essential that you close that loop, that you come back and say, we found this, we didn't find that. we have no idea, but thanks very much for participating. It's crucial. I can't stress it enough, and yet even I find it really difficult to do. So in reflecting, and I've given you some of those reflections as we've gone along, I have to admit that in the last day and a half, I feel like I should give a completely different talk. So I think I'm inventing as I go along, but some of the things, some of the reflections that the participants in our study and the local leads shared with us. First, about the benefits and the risks of good participatory practices. The benefits were that they felt it was really a good tool for engaging various kinds of stakeholders, because we weren't just thinking about the person who was interested in participating as enrolling in the clinical trial, but also thinking about the communities themselves, about the authorities, how we communicate with authorities to get some buy-in, to also help to dispel some of the rumors going on. One of the communities had a long-standing relationship with religious leaders who do a regular open house kind of debate or discussion. They brought the topic to the religious leaders discussion, and this was a popular forum for many people to hear and learn about. And so they were able to talk about and hear the questions and then discuss and share the outcomes. So they felt it was a good tool for engaging various stakeholders. They did feel that it could, if well done, would foster trustworthiness, addressing the misconceptions of the community. And it also helped them to be prepared and think about high levels of government. Another interesting issue that happened were elections. If a clinical trial goes on long enough in a community, those authorities that you have permission from eventually change, and they change rapidly and suddenly. So when an election happened, they had to re-implement the good participatory practice activities and get buy-in again. And sometimes we'd be like week by week, we'd be on sort of the edge of our seats, wondering whether or not the local authority, this new, a lead in the health leadership or health and government, would be willing to continue with the trial, or if we would be saying, okay, it's over, because they, for whatever reason, maybe didn't believe in the trial or didn't think it was a good use of community energies. So the risks then can be overly focused on operational aspects. Operational aspects like this particular study was designed to have a weekly follow-up telephone call with the participants in the study for a full year after they received the intervention. Nice idea. Call somebody up once a week, ask them how they're feeling, ask them a set of the same questions over and over again. Do you think that we've been successful with it? Some of the callers reported things like getting rude answers from the participants. That's when they even picked up the phone. Eventually, some of the groups, well, the first group that started to face this had to make house-to-house, door-to-door visits with each of the participants in the community to find out were they still interested in being enrolled in the trial. We heard all sorts of stories about why they weren't answering their phone calls. Everything from "I'm just too busy, I don't have time for it," to they were giving data, small amounts of data to everybody who participated to make sure that the telephone calls weren't a burden for them in terms of cost. They would say, "Well, I used the data, I used it up." Well, who did they use it up on? I was calling my mom. I don't get a chance to speak to her very often, and now I had the data to have like a decent phone call with her. And I can't travel right now because I don't have an active vaccine in my body that I know of. And so, I was using the phone calls for other things. Some were incarcerated. That was an interesting thing. Initially, the good participatory practitioners said, "Oh, they're incarcerated, we can't follow up with them anymore." And there was like this pause on the phone, everybody thinking, well, you know where they are. you can follow up with them. And then they had to get permission from authorities, from the, the judicial system to go in and follow up with those participants. So they did follow up with them. That was an interesting story. And others were just, they just didn't have the time, or they were being called at the wrong time of day. So if they were called during normal business hours, that wasn't practical for a lot of people. So learning to call in the evenings, providing the callers with either stipends to call from home themselves so they didn't have to come into the call centers, or engaging them to make sure that they weren't overburdened themselves so that these phone calls could take place. All of those things. But I have a suspicion that if we'd had a conversation with some of the implementers early on, or some of the the community members early on, I think we would have heard that this wasn't going to be a likely, successful design choice. And given that that flaw took place, we had to kind of push it. We might have been able to avoid that in the first instance if people had understood what kind of burden that might have had. And so I think it's worth publishing it. The other problem, of course, is the tokenism problem. I think this is the case with all kinds of engagement or patient representation. When we try to involve some people, the problem is that we won't be able to engage everyone. And if individuals begin to see that as tokenistic, if they see themselves as marginalized or excluded from the process, then we run into these kinds of problems. It's an issue, it's a sustained issue. I think being as open as possible, having two-way communication as much as possible, demonstrating how we hear, not just that we collect the feedback from the community, but that we use the feedback from the community and going back to them and saying, this is how we used your feedback. Or alternatively, we couldn't use your feedback for the following reasons. But going back and doing that helps to eliminate that sense of tokenism. So I strongly recommend, again, that when we're involved in this kind of good participatory practice, that part of that is really genuinely having the exchange and demonstrating that exchange. So one of our respondents said these types of projects definitely need a team that has a lot of experience and know-how to engage the people, to communities. They need to know how to do it, have some experience. And I think all of the information and all of the communication before actually starting is fundamental. And this from a crew that were learning on the fly and did an exceptionally good job at doing it at the same time. Second, sense of some of the reflections was about the contextuality and some of the ethical challenges. So they described risk perception and how that was very dynamic during the pandemic. Not surprising. Early on, everybody felt they needed vaccine. Now people are kind of like, do I need a vaccine? Is it bad again? And we're asking, what's the new variant? And, is it going to hospitalize me? Is it not? So risk perception definitely had an impact on recruitment and the way people received the trial. You're getting ready to give me 2 minutes. Okay, that's good, thanks. And then availability of vaccines was another issue, where the vaccines were coming from and what kind of vaccines, but also the vaccine rollout that was available in some countries. In one country, they rolled out just as the trial was getting launched. Everybody had vaccine access, and the feeling was, will we be able to recruit anybody? In another country, they only had 10% availability, so that the only 10%, there was only availability of vaccine for 10% of the population. So many people were enrolling because they didn't have any access to anything else. And then we, of course, have to ask questions about therapeutic misconception and what that does. Although I could give a full talk on the problems associated with that. So national vaccine rollout, changes of government, these were all, things that we bumped into, variabilities and changing health policies as a result. And as I said before, there is this instrumental value of GPP. I mean, GPP is good for trust maintaining and access and all of that. But if the follow-up calls is the only thing you're focusing on, it becomes instrumentalized. And I think we have to do better than that and not forget about it. And then a question, I think, for all of you, which is one of the biggest questions that's emerged over the 3 years for us, is about who can influence a platform trial design. So from early on, when a placebo trial was suggested, the local PIs were all asking the same question, and our national leads kept coming back to us with exactly the same question: how are you running a placebo trial when we know that there are existing vaccines that are at least being used and distributed for emergency with emergency use permissions? And it was almost impossible to figure out how we could justify that. And the truth is, I think that's part of a story that we all have to to confront and deal with. In the end, it was justifiable when there was no vaccine available. It was less justifiable and then therefore less feasible to run the trial when there was vaccine available in the countries. So thinking about that and wondering how can an adaptive platform trial adapt nimbly enough at the time when the political or the social context is changing is something that we weren't successful at. I don't think so. And so the need for consistency and collaboration. Sorry. Oh, sorry. I'm not seeing it change. I think we've covered pretty much all of this. I want to end with some of the key lessons learned. That strong good participatory practice means balancing the practical aspects that we value with the overall sense that this is a good thing. It will enable participants to share if we pay attention. And maybe that's where I need to end. I think there's lots more to be said about it, but we need to be able to be better partners when we implement platform trials. Thanks.